Chief Spokane Garry, son of a chief, grandson of a chief, heir of a remarkable prophecy. He was born with the Salish name Slokicha. As recently as 1 year ago, the Spokesman Review said nobody has quite still figured out what the name Slokicha means in the original native tongue. But I tell you, probably even this morning as we're talking about it, somebody somewhere is working on it, so someday they'll probably figure that out. He was, however, eventually given the name Spokane Garry, and I'll tell you the circumstances of that a little bit later. This pencil sketch of Garry was done when he was about 20 years old with his knowledge and permission. And the signature at the bottom of it, I hope you can see it there, reads Spokane, K-A-N. He didn't put an E on the end, so it's often spelled that way if you see it in my presentation. Spokane Garry. It reads on the right, head chief of the Spokane tribe, and then that little inscription below says, the above name is written by Garry himself. He had lovely handwriting. I've never written that well in my life. His handwriting also shows, if you do any handwriting analysis, a lofty spirit with a philosophical kind of orientation to life, and all of that was certainly true of him. Spokane Garry was the grandson of a chief named Circling Raven. Circling Raven is known for the very famous aspect of his life, probably the most famous thing, which came to be called the One Prophecy. Many of the tribes in this area, the inland Northwest, had various prophecies, visions of a time that would come in the future when some kind of enlightenment would take place. But by far the best attested and best known of these, this is wonderful. Mr. Ingard and Mr. Dykstra, I just came out of the zone and realized here you are. Spokane Garry, the man. So anyway, the best attested of these prophecies that came down was certainly the one that goes back to Circling Raven. I actually read to you one version of it, a very well attested version, but the main outline of the prophecy, as you may recall, goes something like this. This would be in the mid to late 1700s, and Circling Raven was the chief of the Middle Spokane tribe. There was the Upper, Middle, and Lower Spokanes, and the Middle Spokanes, he was the chief of them. He suffered the loss of his oldest son in a kind of a disease plague that came through and touched many of the children in the tribe, and he was especially deeply affected by it, and it plunged him into what I think we would simply call a deep and protracted depression. Finally, some of his peers, some of the other chiefs of the other tribes, and some of those who were close to him said, look, man, you got to get over this. You've got to come to grips somehow or other. And he agreed. And so he went up on top of what we would call Mount Spokane and remained there for some days. And something happened while he was there. And what it was exactly, of course, is somewhat mysterious. There was no great detailed documentation of it, but at least the best guess and the way he reported it was that he saw some kind of vision in which he was given at least the assurance that his son was safe, and that at some time in the future, people with a pale flesh would come bearing leaves bound together with strange markings on them, and that they would explain the words of the Great Spirit or the words of heaven or something like that. Deeply encouraged by that, Circling Raven returned to his tribe and began to tell them the story, but he thought that part about white flesh was so preposterous, he left it out. But he did tell them that he had seen something that gave him great hope. And from that, it seems that he was reinstated to his chiefly capacities, and time went on. And many, many years later, when he was an old man and had really conferred his responsibilities as chief to his son, whose name was Eliam Spokane, there was an eruption of Mount St. Helen. We know that Mount St. Helen erupted sometime around the year 1800, give or take a few years. That was the most recent before, of course, the 1980 eruption. And in the ash fallout, some of you were here, of course, in Spokane at the time. You recall the sort of apocalyptic experience that we all were having at the moment. Well, it was something like that. And these who were now in these tribes in this region saw this ash falling out, saw the huge black curtain pulling across the sky, and thought it must be the end of the world. And the old chief now, Circling Raven, who was an elderly man, recognizing that this couldn't be the end of the world because the promise he had received had not yet occurred, stood up and announced to the terrified natives there that were in his tribe, this is not the end of the world. The version of the speech that he gave, according to Thomas Jessup, who gives probably the best biography of Spokane Garry, is this. This is from Circling Raven now. Quote, "This is not the end of the world. Much more must come to pass before that time arrives. Let me tell you this. A strange people with a skin of different color, speaking another language and wearing peculiar clothes, will come to us before the world ends. They will bring with them teachers who will show us how to learn things from marks made on leaves bound together in a bundle. Until these people come, the world will continue. Let us get to work and clean up these ashes." So that was the speech, and on that basis, the people were encouraged, and they did clean up the ashes, and indeed the world did not end. At the time he gave that little speech, the main chief was Spokane. His name is spelled various ways. I've chosen arbitrarily to spell it Elium. You'll also see Elim and Elum. So all of those are, I think, legitimate spellings of his name. He himself had become a man of great influence. He was a major chief, of course, in this region, and his reputation was spread to other places as well. When he was an elderly man, the boy Slokitcha was born to him. This was his youngest son, and Spokane was now quite an elderly fellow. His birth took place in 1811, and that was just a few months after the first the first traders, fur trappers had showed up. It was two men. One of them was named Finan MacDonald, and the other was named Jacob Finley. Finan MacDonald was a big man with a big red beard. He was Scot, and it was like someone from outer space had showed up to the local natives when they saw him. But of course, they immediately recognized this man with pale flesh, and they thought maybe he was one of the ones that had been spoken of in the prophecy. As it turns out, of course, these two men had been sent by David Thompson, who was a robust Christian and came to this region the following year, the very year that Slokitcha was born. So there was this initial connection between the prophecy and a man bearing a book, as David Thompson did, this leaves bound together, and so they made that connection at that point. These two trappers, when they approached, came to the chief, to Spokane, and asked if they could build a trading post there on behalf of the Northwest Company for whom David Thompson worked. Spokane, because of his expectations related to this prophecy that had been in the air for so many years, gave his consent to that and actually pitched his teepee not too far from what came to be called the Spokane House. And so that, of course, is a place you can visit to this day. Slokitcha, therefore, grew up in the vicinity of these white traders. So he was not as put off by people with pale flesh, as others might have been. He at least had that original experience with them. He also knew from his earliest memories as a child the story, the prophecy that had come down from his grandfather, who he never met. But his father, Spokane, had given him this information. And so all of that was part of the culture. All of it was part of what was in the air at the time. Well, when Slokitcha was 14 years old, there was a painful proposition that was put to his family. This came from a man named George Simpson. George Simpson was called the chief factor, which would be the chief governor of, and really the CEO in this part of the world, of the Hudson Bay Company. By this time, the Hudson Bay Company had purchased the Northwest Company, their chief competition, so they were the only game in town. The Hudson Bay Company, as we've talked about before, was a vast commercial enterprise, and it was the closest thing to a government that was operating in this part of not only Western Canada, but this part of the inland Northwest and really the Pacific Northwest. So he was a man of remarkable power and remarkable prestige and some wealth, and he represented the Hudson Bay Company in this part of the world. In 1825, he wrote a letter to Alexander Ross. Alexander Ross was the man who ran the Spokane House on behalf of the Hudson Bay Company here. The grammar is not wonderful, but you'll get the idea. George Simpson requested native students to take to the Red River Mission, which was in Winnipeg, Manitoba. The precise language was as follows, quote, 2 Indian boys of about 8 years of age of the Spokane or Nez Perce tribe were got from their relations for the purpose of being educated at the school. So this letter shows up. Alexander Ross, who has, of course, a good relationship with the local chiefs of the local tribes, puts the idea to those chiefs. He gets an initial negative response, but later there's a change of heart. The biography by Jessett, based on the journal of Alexander Ross, describes it as follows. The chiefs were very indignant at first, solicited their giving up their sons, and asked him if they were looked upon as dogs, willing to give up their children to go they knew not whither. But when he told them they were going to a minister of religion to learn how to know and serve God, they said he might have hundreds of children in an hour's time. And he selected 2, being the sons of the most powerful chiefs in that part of the country. So once it was determined that the request for these sons was somehow again compatible with that white man's book of heaven, and so on, all of a sudden there was a change of heart and a ready willingness to surrender their children in that interest. Simpson's own journal, George Simpson's own journal, describes his interaction with the local chiefs, Eliam Spokane in particular, in these words. This is April 8th, 1825. Had a long interview with 8 chiefs belonging to the Flathead, Kootenai, Spokane, and other tribes assembled here for the purpose of seeing me. By the way, I'm using the original spelling in case you think I'm that bad a speller. The Spokane and Flathead chiefs put a son each under my care to be educated at the Missionary Society School, Red River, and all the chiefs joined in a most earnest request that a missionary or religious instruction should be placed among them. So there was clearly a desire that missionaries would be sent into this part of the world, almost as a quid pro quo for giving these 2 children to Simpson. Alexander Ross, who ran the Spokane House here, wrote in his journal on the same date, one of the boys was the son of a Kootenai chief named by us Pelly, after the governor of Hudson's Bay Company. The other was a son of one of the Spokane chiefs. We called him Gary, after one of the directors. They were about 10 or 12 years old, both fine, promising youths of equal age. He was off in his ages. Gary was actually 14 at the time. Pelly was about 13. All right, I'm going to drop to a little footnote here, because we really can't appreciate the story of Gary unless we know something of this Red River settlement. And so if you'll let me just kind of take this little detour for a moment, I think it'll be helpful.